I never imagined that something as ordinary as warming up my truck on a freezing morning would end up detonating the most expensive chain reaction our neighborhood had ever seen, but looking back now, that moment in my driveway was the first domino to fall in what would become a full-blown HOA disaster. My name is Ethan Walker, and for nearly a decade I had lived quietly in the Pine Hollow Estates community just outside Fort Collins, Colorado, keeping my head down, paying my dues, and doing my best to be the kind of neighbor people could rely on without ever really thinking about it. I ran a small snow removal and grounds maintenance business. Nothing flashy, just me, a couple of seasonal helpers, and my diesel Ram 3500 with a heavy-duty plow bolted to the front. A truck that wasn't just transportation but the backbone of my entire livelihood. Winters in northern Colorado are no joke, and when snow hits, it hits hard, which meant my days often started long before sunrise, sometimes at 4 in the morning, sometimes earlier if the forecast looked ugly. On the morning everything changed. The temperature had plunged to negative single digits overnight, the kind of cold that bites through gloves and turns breath into fog instantly, and when I stepped outside that morning the air felt brittle, like it might shatter if you moved too fast. 6 inches of fresh snow covered the street, smooth and untouched, with more expected by late morning, and I knew I had a narrow window to clear my commercial contracts before the next wave buried everything again. I did what I had done hundreds of times before. Climbed into my truck, turned the key, and let the diesel engine rumble awake, that deep, mechanical growl echoing softly through the quiet neighborhood. Anyone who's ever owned a diesel in winter knows you don't just fire it up and peel out. The fuel needs to warm, the engine needs time, and more importantly, you need your windshield to defrost unless you enjoy driving blind on icy roads. I set the heat to full, defrosters blasting, and stepped back inside to grab my coffee and double-check my route, fully intending to be back out in 10 or 15 minutes and on my way. That was when I saw her. Marlene Kravitz, the Pine Hollow Estates HOA president, striding across the street toward my driveway with the unmistakable posture of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She was bundled in a pristine white parka that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill, her boots untouched by snow, and her lips pressed into that familiar thin line of self-righteous disapproval I'd seen aimed at half the neighborhood over the years. Marlene didn't wave or greet me. She didn't even pretend this was a friendly check-in. She stopped a few feet from my truck, pointed directly at the running engine, and announced, loud enough for nearby houses to hear, that I was in violation of HOA bylaws for excessive vehicle idling. At first I honestly thought she was joking. I laughed, told her I was just warming up my work truck so I could see out the windshield, and said I'd be gone in a minute. Her expression didn't change. Instead, she pulled out her phone, scrolled with deliberate slowness, and read aloud the exact clause from the HOA rulebook stating that no vehicle could idle in a residential driveway for more than 5 minutes, citing noise and environmental concerns. I tried to explain calmly at first that this wasn't some joyride or laziness, that this truck was how I paid my mortgage, that diesel engines in sub-zero weather weren't optional about warm-ups if you wanted them to last more than a season. She cut me off mid-sentence, informing me that personal inconvenience was not an exemption and that rules applied equally to everyone, regardless of occupation. Then she told me I'd be receiving a fine. $200. For letting my truck defrost. I felt my jaw tighten as the absurdity of it hit me, the cold, the snowstorm, the fact that half the neighborhood did the same thing every winter without consequence, but arguing with Marlene was like arguing with a brick wall that enjoyed watching you get tired. She finished by reminding me that repeated violations would result in escalating penalties, wished me a productive day, and walked back across the street, already typing on her phone as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than checking an item off a to-do list. I stood there for a moment, staring after her, anger and disbelief swirling together in my chest, then climbed back into my truck and drove off to work, unaware that by the time I returned home, that $200 fine would already be setting off conversations, consequences, and calculations that would eventually cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars and fracture the community in ways no snowstorm ever could. By the time the second week of winter hit, the consequences of that HOA fine were no longer theoretical or symbolic. They were loud, freezing, and impossible to ignore because the first real storm rolled in on a Sunday night, dumping nearly 16 inches of heavy, wet snow across the entire complex. And for the first time in 5 years, I did absolutely nothing about it. I didn't warm up the truck, didn't fire the plow, didn't send my usual group text letting residents know I'd be out early. I just watched from my kitchen window as the snow kept falling, knowing full well that by morning the single entrance road, the visitor parking lanes, the fire access corridor, and the entire rear lot would be buried solid. And when my alarm went off at 5 a.m. like it always did during storms, I shut it off and rolled back over, because according to the HOA's own letter, my idling vehicle constituted an unnecessary disturbance, and I decided I was done providing unnecessary services. Especially since nowhere in my contract or their bylaws did it say I was obligated to plow for free after being fined for doing my job properly, and right on schedule. The phone started buzzing at 6:12 a.m. First one missed call, then another, then a text from the HOA vice president asking if my truck had broken down, which I ignored, then a longer message saying residents couldn't get out for work and asking when I planned to start plowing, which I also ignored because this time I wanted them to feel the full weight of the decision they'd made so casually over a clipboard and a complaint form. And by 7 a.m. my phone was blowing up with residents panicking about missed shifts, school closures, delivery drivers stuck at the gate, and one woman claiming she'd slipped trying to walk through knee-high snow to the bus stop. And the irony was thick enough to shovel because this was the same woman who had liked the HOA's Facebook post reminding everyone about noise violations. And around 7:30 the HOA president herself finally called, voice tight and clipped, demanding to know why the lot hadn't been plowed yet, and I calmly reminded her that I was no longer providing plowing services due to the fine they'd issued for idling my truck, explaining, slowly, clearly, that warming up a diesel engine in sub-zero temperatures wasn't optional, it was necessary, and that fining me for it meant I was no longer willing to expose myself to further penalties or liability, especially without written clarification or compensation. And she snapped back that plowing was a community expectation, to which I replied that expectations don't pay fines, don't cover maintenance, and don't protect against HOA enforcement actions. And then I hung up because for the first time the power dynamic had flipped, and they had no idea how badly they'd miscalculated, because by 9 a.m. the situation had escalated from inconvenience to crisis. Emergency vehicles couldn't access the rear buildings, a postal truck got stuck halfway up the incline and blocked the only exit lane, residents were arguing in the snow, slipping, yelling, shovels snapping under the weight, and someone finally called the city to complain, only to be told that since the parking lot and access road were private HOA property, snow removal was the association's responsibility, not the municipality's, which triggered an emergency HOA board meeting via Zoom that I later found out about because one of the board members, an older guy named Frank who had always been decent to me, texted me screenshots of the chat, showing the president frantically asking if they could just rescind the fine, and Frank replying that it didn't work like that once enforcement action had been taken, especially if it caused damages or service withdrawal, and that's when the real panic set in because at noon, the fire department showed up after a resident with a heart condition called for assistance and the ambulance couldn't get within 200 feet of the building, forcing EMTs to haul equipment through deep snow, and the fire chief didn't yell or threaten. He just quietly asked for the HOA's insurance information and reminded them that blocked emergency access was a serious liability issue, and suddenly that $150 idling fine looked microscopic compared to what was coming. And by mid-afternoon the HOA president was back on the phone, tone completely different now, apologetic, asking what it would take to resolve the misunderstanding, and I told her, calmly and without emotion, that there was no misunderstanding, that they had enforced a rule without understanding the operational reality, that they had penalized a service provider for standard safety practice, and that I would not resume plowing unless 3 conditions were met. The fine was formally rescinded in writing. A new addendum was added to the bylaws explicitly exempting winter vehicle idling for maintenance purposes, and my services were compensated at market rate going forward, because I was done being the unpaid backbone of their infrastructure while being treated like a nuisance. And she hesitated, actually hesitated, before saying she'd need board approval, and I told her that was fine because the forecast showed another storm coming in 48 hours, heavier than the first, and I could wait. And when I hung up, I didn't feel angry or smug. I felt calm because for once I wasn't scrambling to fix a problem someone else created. I was letting consequences do the work, and the fallout only grew from there. Residents started demanding refunds on HOA fees, accusing the board of negligence. Someone posted photos of the unplowed lot on social media tagging the city, the fire department, and the local news station, and within hours a reporter had reached out asking for comment, which the HOA declined, while I simply said I was no longer providing volunteer services due to enforcement action taken against me. And that single sentence did more damage than any rant ever could, because by the end of the day the HOA's own lawyer had emailed requesting a discussion, and that's when I knew Section 2 of this story wasn't about snow anymore. It was about control, accountability, and what happens when an HOA finally realizes the person they pushed around was the one holding the shovel, the truck, and all the leverage the entire time. By the next morning, the HOA's situation had deteriorated from embarrassing to unsalvageable, because overnight temperatures dropped even further, turning the half-cleared footpaths residents had hacked out with shovels into solid sheets of ice. And when the sun came up, it revealed a parking lot that looked less like a residential community and more like an abandoned industrial site, cars frozen in place, wheels locked in slush, bumpers buried, and people standing around filming on their phones, while arguing about who was at fault. And the irony was brutal because just days earlier the same board had congratulated itself on strict enforcement improving neighborhood standards. And now those standards were quite literally frozen into the ground, and at 8:04 a.m. my phone rang again, this time from an unfamiliar number, which turned out to be the HOA's attorney, a smooth-voiced guy who opened with polite legal language about seeking an amicable resolution. But the moment I mentioned the fire chief's visit, his tone shifted because he knew exactly what that meant. Exposure, liability, documentation, and I calmly laid out the timeline again, the fine, the lack of warning, the refusal to understand diesel operation in winter, the public fallout, and I made it clear I wasn't asking for favors, I was asking for corrections. And when he suggested I resume plowing in good faith, while the board reviewed my conditions, I said no because good faith goes both ways, and mine had already been monetized, penalized, and dismissed. And by late morning the emergency board meeting reconvened, this time with the lawyer present. And Frank later told me it was chaos, residents screaming in the Zoom chat, one board member crying because her husband couldn't get to work and had lost wages, another member blaming the property manager blaming the bylaws, and the lawyer quietly reminding them that none of that mattered if someone got seriously injured or worse. Because blocked access combined with documented refusal to resolve a known issue was exactly how HOAs ended up on the wrong side of lawsuits. And finally, the president voted to rescind the fine. But even then they tried to do it verbally, off the record, asking me to just move past it. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't over, because rescinding a fine without addressing the policy that caused it was just setting up the next enforcement cycle, so I declined again, politely, and within hours the second storm system hit earlier than forecast, dumping another foot of snow on top of the mess, completely overwhelming any resident-led efforts. And when a delivery truck jackknifed trying to exit the rear lane and blocked it entirely, the situation tipped into full-scale disaster. Police showed up to redirect traffic but couldn't do much, tow companies refused to enter due to liability, and residents began openly demanding the board members resign, and then the local news story dropped, a short segment at first showing drone footage of the Snowden complex with the reporter saying, residents say a dispute between an HOA and a contractor has left them trapped. And even though they never named me, everyone knew, and the comments section exploded, people siding with the Plow guy, mocking the HOA for biting the hand that cleared the roads, and that public pressure did what reason couldn't, because by that evening I received a formal email, not a call, not a text, but a proper legal document, rescinding the fine, amending the winter vehicle policy to explicitly allow engine idling for maintenance and safety purposes, and offering a paid plowing contract retroactive to the beginning of the season, complete with indemnification language protecting me from future enforcement actions related to snow operations. And I didn't reply immediately, because leverage only works if you don't rush to spend it, and overnight the situation worsened again. An elderly resident slipped and broke her wrist. Another had to be helped out by neighbors when her heat went out and emergency services couldn't reach her driveway, and suddenly the HOA's insurance carrier got involved, sending an urgent notice demanding proof of mitigation efforts, which they couldn't provide, and by morning the board was done, completely broken, because 3 members resigned on the spot, including the president, leaving the association without a quorum and forcing the property management company to step in temporarily. And that's when everything shifted, because the same manager who'd once brushed off my concerns now called me personally, apologized without qualifiers, and asked me to help, not as a favor, not as a volunteer, but as a paid service provider with full authority over snow operations. And I agreed, but on my terms, because I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. I was interested in making sure this never happened again. And when I finally fired up the truck that afternoon, letting it warm properly while residents watched from windows and balconies, nobody complained, nobody filmed, nobody said a word, because they understood now what that engine sound really meant. And within hours the lot was cleared, access restored, emergency lanes reopened, and the crisis ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. But the aftermath lingered, because over the following weeks the HOA underwent a complete restructuring. Bylaws were rewritten with actual operational input, enforcement procedures were revised to require expert consultation before fines, and residents voted overwhelmingly to eliminate arbitrary nuisance penalties. And as for me, I didn't just get paid, I got respect because the new board consulted me before storms, deferred to my judgment, and even asked me to review other maintenance policies, and the funniest part was that months later, during a summer meeting, someone joked about the great snow lockdown, and the room went quiet because everyone remembered how close they'd come to disaster over a $150 fine, and that was the real lesson, not about snow or trucks or idling engines, but about power, because HOAs love rules until those rules collide with reality, and when they do, the people who actually keep things running aren't replaceable, they're essential, and once you realize that, you stop treating them like a line item and start listening before the ground freezes again. After the snow finally melted and the parking lot returned to something resembling normal pavement, most people assumed the story was over, that the HOA had learned its lesson, rewritten a few rules, paid a few bills, and everyone would quietly move on. But that's not how power structures work once they've been embarrassed, because while the surface calm returned, underneath it there was tension, resentment, and a quiet scramble to regain control, and I could feel it in the way emails were worded, in the sudden formality of conversations that had once been friendly, and in the way certain former board members, especially those who hadn't resigned but had lost influence, started watching me like I was a problem that hadn't been fully neutralized yet, and that's when the subtle stuff began, not fines or open confrontations, but paperwork delays, contract reviews, sudden requests for documentation they'd never asked for before, like proof of insurance renewals weeks ahead of schedule, equipment certifications, noise compliance acknowledgments, all framed as routine but clearly targeted, and if this had happened a year earlier, I might have brushed it off or scrambled to comply, but after what they'd put the entire community through, I'd learned to slow down and read between the lines, because this wasn't about safety or process, it was about clawing back authority after losing it so publicly, and the first real sign came when I received a notice stating that the HOA was considering competitive bids for snow removal services next season, even though my contract was current, paid, and included renewal language, and when I asked the property manager about it, he hesitated just long enough to tell me everything, before admitting that a small group of residents, led by one former board member in particular, had been pushing for my removal, claiming I was difficult, uncooperative, and had leveraged a crisis for personal gain, which was rich considering I'd spent years saving them money by doing the work myself. But the most interesting part was that their argument wasn't that I'd done anything wrong, it was that I now had too much influence, and that phrase stuck with me because influence is only threatening to people who expect obedience, and instead of reacting emotionally, I did what they never expected. I documented everything, every email, every call, every request, every policy change, every incident from the fine to the fire department visit, assembling a clean, chronological record that showed not just what happened, but why it happened. And when the HOA announced an open forum meeting to discuss future service arrangements, I attended, not as an angry contractor, but as a prepared one, and that meeting was where the story took another sharp turn, because what was supposed to be a controlled discussion quickly unraveled when residents started asking questions, real ones, about why the HOA had fined the person responsible for emergency access, why they hadn't consulted experts before enforcing rules, why they tried to quietly move on without accountability, and why now, months later, they were trying to push out the very person who had pulled them out of a disaster. And as the former board member leading the charge fumbled through vague answers about governance and balance, I calmly stood up and asked a single question that cut through everything: whether the HOA had disclosed to residents that their insurance premiums had increased following the winter incident, because of documented risk exposure, and the room went silent, because that wasn't public knowledge yet, and the property manager visibly stiffened. And that's when the truth spilled out, because yes, premiums had gone up, yes, the carrier had flagged the association as high risk, and yes, part of the reason was the initial enforcement action against the service provider that resulted in blocked emergency access. And suddenly the narrative flipped again, because now it wasn't about me having influence, it was about certain people trying to deflect blame and consequences, and one resident asked outright whether replacing me would lower premiums, and the answer, awkward, unavoidable, was no, because insurers cared about policies, procedures, and accountability, not personalities, and that was when the final attempt at control surfaced, because the same former board member proposed a new rule requiring all service vehicles to be HOA approved and operated only during designated hours, which sounded reasonable on paper until you realized it would make emergency response during storms impossible. And when I pointed that out, backed by written guidance from the fire department and city codes, the proposal collapsed in real time, exposed for what it was: another attempt to regulate without understanding reality. And after that meeting, something shifted permanently, because residents stopped seeing me as the Plow guy and started seeing me as someone who understood how the place actually functioned, and within weeks I was asked, informally at first, then formally, to join a newly created advisory committee focused on infrastructure and emergency preparedness, a committee that existed specifically because the board had failed so badly before, and while I had no interest in HOA politics, I accepted for one reason only. I wanted a seat at the table where decisions that affected safety were made, not to control them but to prevent stupidity before it turned into disaster, and the pushback was immediate: whispers about conflicts of interest, accusations that I was positioning myself for control, but none of it stuck because everything I said was documented, transparent, and grounded in reality, and over time even the skeptics quieted down, because the difference between authority and competence became impossible to ignore, and the most ironic part was that by trying to punish me for idling a truck, the HOA had accidentally created the very thing they feared most. A system where rules had to make sense, enforcement had to be informed, and power had limits, and that realization didn't just change snow policies, it started reshaping everything from maintenance schedules to vendor contracts to how complaints were handled, and by the time the next winter approached, the HOA wasn't asking whether trucks could idle anymore, they were asking how to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. Not because they trusted blindly, but because they'd finally learned that control without understanding isn't order, it's just delayed chaos. By the time the next winter arrived, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed so completely that it was almost unrecognizable from the place where this all started, because what had once been a rigid, complaint-driven HOA culture had slowly been replaced by something quieter but far more functional. And that shift didn't happen because people suddenly became nicer or wiser, it happened because everyone, from residents to board members to the property manager, had been forced to confront a simple truth they'd spent years avoiding, which was that systems don't run on authority alone. They run on people who actually know what they're doing, and that realization showed itself in small but telling ways, like how the first snow forecast of the season triggered a planning email instead of a warning notice, how the board asked for my availability and input days in advance, how residents stopped peeking through blinds waiting to complain and instead sent messages asking if I needed anything cleared or salted first, and when the storm finally hit, heavier than the one that had started everything the year before, there was no panic, no chaos, no drama because the truck warmed up exactly as long as it needed to. The plow ran smoothly, emergency lanes stayed clear, and nobody questioned it, not because they were afraid of consequences, but because they understood the reasoning now. And standing there afterward, looking at a fully cleared lot while snow was still falling in surrounding neighborhoods, it hit me that this wasn't really about snow removal anymore. It was about what happens when someone draws a line and refuses to be punished for doing things correctly because that single fine, so small and petty at the time, had exposed a much larger flaw in how the HOA operated, a flaw that had nearly turned into a real tragedy, and once exposed it couldn't be hidden again, no matter how badly some people wanted to rewind the story, and over the following months the changes became permanent, codified into bylaws, procedures, and expectations. Emergency access policies were rewritten with input from fire officials. Enforcement actions now required a review process instead of a clipboard decision, and the advisory committee I joined quietly became one of the most influential parts of the association, not because it had power but because it prevented bad decisions before they happened, and the people who had once pushed hardest against me slowly faded out of relevance, some moving away, some resigning, some simply going quiet when their usual tactics stopped working, and the funny thing was, nobody celebrated their exit because the culture had matured past needing villains. And that was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of all, that the conflict didn't end in some dramatic victory lap, but in a steady, practical normalization of respect, and every now and then a new resident would ask why certain rules were written the way they were, why winter operations had so many exemptions and explanations built in, and someone would casually say, because once upon a time, the HOA fined the wrong guy, and that would be the end of it, a cautionary tale wrapped in understatement. And as for me, I didn't become some permanent fixture of HOA leadership, didn't chase influence or recognition because I never wanted control, I wanted clarity, and once that existed, my role naturally settled back into something simpler, more balanced, where I did my job, got paid fairly, and wasn't treated like a problem for understanding how things actually worked. And looking back, the most ironic part of the entire saga was how avoidable it all had been, how a single conversation, a single question asked with curiosity instead of authority, could have prevented weeks of chaos, legal exposure, public embarrassment, and financial loss. But HOAs don't tend to run on curiosity, they run on enforcement, until enforcement collides with reality, and reality always wins eventually, and if there was a lesson buried under all that snow, it was this. Rules exist to serve people, not the other way around, and the moment an HOA forgets that, the smallest decision, like finding a truck for idling, can spiral into something far bigger than anyone ever intended, and by the time that lesson finally sinks in, the damage has already been done. The only question left is whether the people involved are willing to learn from it or repeat it, and in this case at least, the lesson stuck, not because it was written in a handbook, but because everyone remembered how cold it felt when the rules mattered more than common sense.